But before he left, he called me 32 times. I didn't pick up a single one. That day, I stormed into the conference room and slammed my palm on the table. Who signed off on this? Henry Zhang, the VP, stood up and said the process was compliant. When did he sign? I demanded. 3 days ago, he said. The whole company knew he was leaving. Everyone except me, his wife. I was the last to find out. You ask what I felt in that moment? Anger? Betrayal? No. It was a cold that seeped from the marrow of my bones. Because suddenly I remembered he had sat in the living room that night, waiting for me for hours, 2 bowls of noodles on the table, already congealed into a starchy mess. He said, "Serena, there's something I'd like to talk to you about." I didn't even look up. Go ahead. He didn't. The heavy oak door of the CEO's office slammed against the wall with a deafening crack. Serena Chen stood in the doorway, dressed in a razor-sharp black pantsuit, 7-inch stilettos on her feet, her long hair coiled in a flawless bun at the nape of her neck. Her face was pale as parchment, her eyes rimmed red, her lips bloodless from being pressed too hard between her teeth. Inside, 7 or 8 executives were seated around the conference table, mid-meeting, with quarterly reports glowing on the projector screen. Every head swiveled toward the intruder. The room went silent. Serena's gaze swept across each face. Her voice came out like splintered ice. Who signed it? No one answered. I asked you, who signed off on Ethan Lin's resignation? Henry Zhang, seated at the VP's spot beside the head of the table, rose slowly and adjusted his glasses. Serena, I approved Ethan's departure. The process was fully compliant. His non-compete, project handover, file transfer. Did I ask you about that? She cut him off, striding to the table and planting her palms flat on its polished surface, her nails nearly gouging the wood. I'm asking you, where is he going? I'm asking you, where is he going? Henry paused for 2 seconds. Velaris, VP of Technology. 800,000 a year, plus options. 800,000. Someone in the room sucked in a breath. Velaris was one of the top 3 internet giants in the country. Poaching their technical director from a mid-sized tech firm with an offer like that, it was a power move, no question. But Serena didn't seem to register the number at all. She fixed Henry with a stare. When? The headhunter first approached Ethan about 2 months ago. I mean, when did TT sign? Henry swallowed. 3 days ago. 3 days. Serena's knees buckled slightly. She braced herself against the table's edge, her knuckles white. 3 days ago. And all of you knew? The conference room was a tomb. Fine. She drew a long, shaky breath, and her voice steadied into something eerily calm. Fine. You all knew. The whole company knew my husband was leaving, and I, his wife, was the last person on earth to hear it. Her voice cracked on the last few words, fraying at the edges. Then Zoe Zhou, the administrative assistant who'd been hovering in the corner, stepped forward half a pace. Her lips parted, closed, parted again. Finally, she found her nerve. Miss Chen, Mr. Lin, he called you. A lot. Serena whipped around. What? He started calling last month. Zoe's voice dwindled with each word, but every syllable landed like a stone in the still room. The first time the headhunter reached out, he wanted to talk to you about it. Then, when he signed the letter of intent, he called again. And the day he signed the final contract, he called 32 times. 32. Serena felt something inside her collapse. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. They were all. Zoe's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. Forwarded to your assistant. She said you were in meetings with clients on business trips. Every call got turned away. The last time Mr. Lin called, he said, "Just tell her I'm leaving." And then, he never called again. Serena swayed. Her hand shot out to steady herself against the table. She started remembering those days in fragments. Catherine, her personal assistant, did compile a list of missed calls every day. But during that period, Serena had been buried in due diligence and that was that. Did he? Serena's lips trembled. Did he say anything else? Zoe shook her head. Nothing. Just that he wanted you to know. The silence in the room was so absolute that the low hum of the HVAC system seemed deafening. Every head was bowed. No one dared look at Serena's face. Slowly, Serena released her grip on the table and took a step back. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor. She straightened her spine, and the expression that settled over her features was hollowed out, like everything had been scooped clean, leaving only a shell. Meeting adjourned, she said. No one moved. I said adjourned. Her voice was barely there, but no one dared disobey. One by one, the executives gathered their things and filed out in silence. As they passed Serena, each one took care to step lightly, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. Henry was the last to reach the door. He glanced back, opened his mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it and pulled the door softly, shut behind him. The office fell still. Serena stood frozen, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Her gaze drifted to the conference table. There sat a cold cup of coffee, black, no sugar. Ethan's habit. He always drank his coffee that way during meetings. And then she remembered. One night last month, she'd come home late from work, and Ethan had been sitting in the living room, waiting. 2 bowls of noodles on the table, already clumped and cold. Serena, he'd said, there's something I'd like to talk to you about. She'd been replying to an email and hadn't lifted her head. Go ahead. A long silence. Then, never mind, the noodles are cold. I'll heat them up for you. She hadn't eaten them. She'd showered and gone to bed. The next morning when she left, the bowls were still on the table, the noodles dried into a solid, unappetizing mass. She'd been rushing to the airport and dumped them in the trash. That was the last time she remembered Ethan trying to talk to her. Serena sank down, slowly, until she was crouched on the floor. Her stiletto caught on the edge of the carpet, but she didn't care. She let herself curl up against the leg of the conference table, drew her knees to her chest, and buried her face in them. She didn't sob out loud, but her shoulders shook violently. The only sounds in the office were the whisper of the air conditioning and her broken, barely audible gasps, each one wrenched from somewhere deep. She thought of graduation year. The 2 of them crammed into an 80-square-foot studio, summer heat like a steam bath. Ethan had bought a fan and aimed it at her while he sat there drenched in sweat. She thought of the day he got his first job offer, bounding through the door, spinning her around 3 times. Serena, when I make real money, you can buy anything you want. She thought of their wedding day, him in an ill-fitting suit, his palms clammy as he took her hand, whispering, I'm going to take care of you for the rest of my life. She thought of the point. She couldn't pinpoint exactly when their conversations had started to thin. She grew busier, until she came home every night, wanting nothing but to collapse. He cooked dinner and waited. She often didn't get home until it was cold. He called. 8 out of 10 times she was in a meeting. He texted. She replied hours later with a single, okay. He stopped spinning her around. He stopped saying, I want to talk to you about something. He even stopped arguing with her. He just quietly, methodically took care of every small thing around her. Paid the utilities, fixed the leaky sink, watered the plants, booked her parents' doctor appointments, remembered her cycle, and brewed brown sugar tea without her asking. And then one day, he called 32 times. She didn't pick up a single one. And then, he was gone. Serena didn't know how long she'd been crouched there. When she finally lifted her head, the sky outside had darkened to dusk. Her legs were completely numb. She hauled herself up using the table's edge, her knees nearly buckling under her weight. She stumbled to her desk and grabbed her phone. There they were, in her call log, more than 30 missed calls from Ethan Lynn, spanning from a month ago to 3 days ago. She'd been so swamped that her assistant had flagged them as non-urgent. She'd swiped past them without a second thought. She scrolled to his contact and pressed call. Ring, ring, ring. No answer. She called again. Still, no answer. The third time, the call connected, but the voice on the other end wasn't Ethan's. It was a cold, electronic female voice. We're sorry. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. Aza. Serena's hand went slack. The phone slipped from her fingers and hit the carpet with a soft thud, its screen spider webbing with cracks. She stared at the shattered glass, and something clicked into place. He'd changed his number. He was really gone. Serena arrived home at 10 that night. The apartment was pitch black. She stood in the foyer, her hand on the light switch, but she couldn't bring herself to flip it. In the dim glow from the hallway, she could make out a familiar pair of men's slippers on the shoe rack. Grey, fleece-lined, the kind she'd grabbed on clearance last winter, 2 pairs for $12. He'd walked out in those shoes. Serena toed off her heels and stepped inside. The lights came on, and the whole place felt like a hollowed-out shell. She walked to the living room. On the coffee table lay a manila envelope with 2 words written on it in black ink. Serena. Duster. Her fingers trembled as she opened the flap. Inside, a spare key to their apartment, a bank card, and a letter. The letter was written on plain white printer paper, folded into thirds. His handwriting, neat, careful, every stroke deliberate, was unmistakable. Serena, I asked her. I'm leaving. Star. I thought a long time about how to tell you. In the end, I decided to write this letter. I was afraid that if I tried to say it in person, the words would get stuck in my throat. I don't know how you'll feel when you read this, but I hope you won't blame yourself. You haven't done anything wrong. You've always worked so hard, from college all the way to now. You've always pushed harder than I have. It doesn't surprise me that you've reached where you are today. I'm proud of you. It's just, maybe we both forgot that marriage takes 2 people. You have your battlefield, and I need my own direction too. 800,000, 8 million. It's not about the money. I'm leaving because I realized we haven't really talked in a long time. Every night when you came home, I wanted to say something, but you always looked so exhausted, and the words would just lodge in my throat. That day, I asked the assistant to tell you I was leaving. I knew you probably wouldn't hear it, but I still wanted to say it. Daza. It's not that I don't love you. I just think that if we keep going like this, we'll both end up miserable. Keep the key and the card. Don't worry about the house, I've settled all the bills. There's frozen dumplings in the fridge, enough for a week. Don't look for me. I need some time to myself. Nah. Ethan, Arston. Serena read the letter, word by word, 1 syllable at a time. She laid the paper on her lap and stared at the final line for a long, long while. Don't look for me. I need some time to myself. He'd ended 8 years of marriage with such a flat, matter-of-fact sentence. She stood up and walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge. On the second shelf, 6 plastic containers sat in neat rows, each filled with dumplings, each labeled by hand: pork and chives, pork and cabbage, shrimp and 3 delicacies, every kind she loved. She closed the fridge door, leaned her back against its cool surface, and slid slowly down to the floor. The kitchen tiles were cold, the chill seeped through her skirt, and she shivered but didn't get up. She remembered the night she'd woken up with a stomachache, no medicine in the house. Ethan had run to the 24-hour pharmacy downstairs in his slippers, hit 3 different stores before finding the brand she preferred. He'd come back sweating, not even bothering to wipe his forehead before pouring water and feeding her the pills. She remembered her birthday that year. A downpour. He was stuck at a client dinner and called to say he'd ordered a cake. She'd told him not to bother. At 11:30, he came home soaked, clutching a lopsided cake box, the cake squashed on one side, the frosting all smeared. He laughed and said, "The bakery was closed." I knocked forever before the owner agreed to sell me one. She'd been buried in a proposal and said, "Just put it on the counter." The next day, the cake had gone bad, and she'd thrown it out. She threw out that cake. Just like she'd thrown out his noodles and his dozens of calls and everything else she'd deemed not urgent. And now he'd thrown himself out. Serena sat on the tile for more than an hour until her whole body had gone cold before she finally hauled herself up by the counter. She walked to the bedroom and opened the closet. Half his clothes were gone. The ones left were folded neatly on the left side. She reached out and touched them. Cold. He'd been gone for days. She grabbed her phone again and opened WeChat. The last message between them was from 28 days ago. She'd written, "Not coming home this week, project wrap-up." He'd replied, "Okay, take care of yourself." She scrolled up. Message after message, mostly voice notes and texts from her, all variations of not coming home for dinner, working late, meeting, talk later. His responses were always the same. "Okay, got it, take care, get some rest." She scrolled for 3 full minutes, looking for a single complaint, a single expression of frustration, even one, "Why are you never home?" There was nothing. He'd swallowed every disappointment, every loneliness, every ounce of hurt, cleaned his plate of it all. Until one day, he couldn't swallow anymore, and he walked. Serena turned the phone face down on the pillow and curled into the bed. The sheets still smelled like him, that clean, fresh scent of lemon laundry detergent. She'd bought it, and he'd said he liked it. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, the reality of it hit her with full force. The man who'd chased her in college, spun her in the snow, fanned her in that sweltering studio, and run across town in a storm for a cake. He was gone. She was the one who'd pushed him away. The next morning, Serena didn't go to the office. She texted, "I'm out today. Reschedule everything. Hasta." He replied instantly, "Understood. Are you okay? Stast." She didn't answer. She got in her car and drove 2 hours to a small county town, Ethan's hometown. She'd been there once in college when she went with him to meet his parents. They'd lived in an old walk-up then, with coal bricks stacked in the stairwell and peeling paint. His mother had spent the whole afternoon in the kitchen making her a pot of spare rib soup. Later, after they married, his parents moved into a new apartment. Serena had been there a handful of times, always for a quick meal before rushing off. His parents were kind and welcoming, but she'd never quite known how to bridge the distance. She wasn't good with older folks, and work kept her away, even during the holidays. She parked in the lot and sat in the car for a long moment, gathering herself before walking up to the apartment. Ethan's mother opened the door. Eleanor Lynn was in her mid-50s, more than half her hair silver, wearing a clean floral cotton jacket. She blinked at Serena, then offered a complicated smile. "Serena, what brings you here?" "Mom." Serena's voice cracked on the word, and her eyes flooded. Did he come back?" Eleanor ushered her inside, poured her a cup of hot water, and sighed. "He did. Stayed 2 days, then left." "Where did he go?" "He didn't say, just packed some clothes and said he was going to work in another city for a while." Eleanor sat across from her, hands clasped on her knees. After a pause, she asked gently, "Serena, is something going on between you two?" Serena stared down at the steam rising from her cup. Her voice was barely a whisper. "He wants a divorce." A long silence. Just when Serena thought Eleanor might scold her, Ethan's mother spoke again, very softly. "Serena, may I ask you something? Please don't be upset." "Go ahead." "How long has it been since you really looked at him?" Serena's head shot up. Eleanor's eyes glistened, but her voice stayed mild. "I'm not blaming you. I worry about my son. He's always been the quiet type, kept everything to himself. He never wants to trouble anyone." When his father was sick, Ethan stayed at the hospital for a month, came home 10 pounds lighter, and when we asked if he was tired, he said no. "After you two got married, every time he visited, I asked if he was happy. He always said yes. I asked if you were busy, and he said you were, but he understood. He said you'd always been that driven girl, and that was what he loved about you. But once, only once, he came home after a few drinks. I'd never seen him drink that much. He sat on the balcony, watching the sky, and suddenly he said, 'Mum, I feel like I'm just a tenant in her life.'" The cup slipped from Serena's hands and crashed to the floor. Hot water splashed everywhere. She didn't even feel it. She just sat there, staring. A tenant. He'd called himself a tenant in her life. Eleanor went to get a rag, knelt down to mop up the mess, still talking. "He said he'd leave the house in the morning while you were still asleep. He'd be asleep by the time you got home. Sometimes you'd go a whole day without saying 3 words to each other, and when you did, it was things like, 'Did you pay the HOA fee? The car needs maintenance. You go to the parent-teacher conference.' He said your relationship had become as precise as 2 roommates splitting the bills." Serena's tears finally broke free. One drop, then another, burning hot as they landed on her own hands. When he'd said, and dropped it. She'd assumed he'd given up. But he hadn't. He'd just stopped telling her. After she came back from Ethan's hometown, Serena was a different person. She started cancelling unnecessary meetings and social obligations, leaving work on time every day. She went home to the empty apartment, opened the fridge, pulled out one of Ethan's frozen dumpling containers, and boiled a dozen. She sat alone at the table and ate them slowly, one by one. They were perfect. Thin wrappers, generous filling, every pleat neat and even. She counted 15 per box, 6 boxes total, 90 dumplings. Enough for 6 meals. She ate 1 box each day, and while she ate, she pictured him standing in the kitchen on some weekend afternoon, quietly chopping, mixing, rolling, and folding for hours, arranging them in perfect rows before sliding the containers into the freezer. Where had she been while he did that? At the office, in meetings, at client dinners, on business trips, doing everything she'd thought was more important. She scrolled through his WeChat feed. His last post was from a month ago, a photo of a ginkgo tree outside their window, golden leaves scattered across the ground. The caption read simply, "Autumn." She tapped the comment box, typed a few words, deleted them, typed again, deleted again. In the end, she left only, "Pretty." No one had liked or commented on that post. A few hours earlier, it had been a blank slate. She realized then that Ethan hardly ever posted anything about work, or his daily life, or his emotions, maybe 4 posts a year, if that. And she? She'd never even bothered to look closely at those few. She started scrolling through their old photos. Wedding photos, travel photos, candid shots. After 10 minutes of scrolling, she discovered something that made her stomach drop. In the last 2 years, they had almost no photos together at all. The last one was from Spring Festival 2 years ago, taken at his parents' house. She was wearing a red puffer jacket, standing under the winter plum tree in the yard, Ethan's arm around her shoulder. They were both smiling. The tree was in full bloom, clusters of tiny yellow flowers, and even through the screen, she could almost smell them. And then, nothing. 2 years, and they didn't have a single proper photograph of the two of them. Serena put her phone down on the table and rested her head on her arms. The dumpling soup had gone cold, a thin film of oil congealed on the surface. She didn't want to clean up. She didn't want to move. She recalled a thread she'd seen online once. Asked, "When did you realize you'd stopped loving each other?" Thousands of responses. Some said it was when they sat across from each other at dinner, both scrolling on their phones. Others said it was when a whole day passed without speaking and no one found it strange. One woman said it was when her husband got sick and she asked, "Did you take your medicine?" like she was ticking off a checklist. Back then, Serena had thought all of that was melodramatic. Now she understood. Love doesn't disappear all at once. You step back, you miss one moment, then another, and another. You move the other person out of your life, piece by piece, until you've cleared the last one away, and you look up to find you're alone. But she still loved him. She really did. She just hadn't shown it in such a long, long time. Serena made up her mind to find Ethan. First, she went to Villaris's HR department. The receptionist blocked her at the front desk, polite but firm. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Lin hasn't officially started yet. We don't have his contact information on file, and per company policy, new hire details are confidential until the first day of employment." Next, she tracked down Ethan's college roommate, Michael Joe. He ran a sushi restaurant downtown. Serena went straight there, picking a slow hour. Michael didn't look surprised to see her, like he'd been expecting this. He poured her tea and sat across from her. "Ethan told me that if you came looking, I shouldn't tell you where he is." Serena's heart sank. "But he also said something else," Michael continued, taking a sip. "He said, if you came a 3rd time, then I could." "3rd time? First time you come, I say no. 2nd time, still no. 3rd time," he met her eyes. "Is this your first time?" Serena hesitated. "Yes." Michael gave a small, knowing smile. "Then go home." She didn't move. "Serena, you know Ethan. He never shuts the door completely. He says, 'Don't look for me,' but inside, he's hoping you will. He just needs time. And you do too. He looked at her steadily. "One thing he told me once, I've never forgotten it. He said, 'I don't blame her. I'm just tired. Tired of feeling like I don't matter in her life.'" Serena's throat tightened. "Look, I'm not taking his side or rushing you. I'm just saying, you're both good people. You just..." He searched for the word. You hit a dead end. Don't chase him right now. Figure out your own road first. Serena stepped out of the restaurant into rain. She didn't have an umbrella. She walked through it, letting the water soak her hair, her suit, her shoes. Everyone around her was dashing for cover. She was the only one moving at a crawl, like she had nowhere to be. She walked for a long time, until her legs ached, until the rain stopped, until the sky went dark. She found herself on a pedestrian bridge, looking down at the river of taillights streaming below. She pulled out her phone and opened WeChat. She typed a message to the account that would never reply. Ethan, I miss you. Task. No response. She stood on the bridge, holding her phone, until the night wind cut through her. Then she turned and walked home. She knew he wouldn't reply, but those 3 words, she'd owed them for at least a year. Serena started sending Ethan one WeChat message every day. Not long confessions or desperate pleas, just a sentence or a photo. Quiet, unobtrusive, the way he'd always reached out to her. A small, steady presence, slowly being reintroduced into his life. It's raining today, Ada. I cooked your dumplings, 1 box left, Azada. The ginkgo tree at the office turned yellow. I changed the filter in that humidifier you bought, Ada asked. Paid the HOA fee, Tas. Your mum called. Asked if I'd eaten. I said yes, your dumplings. Message after message dropped into a void. No reply. She didn't expect one. She just felt she owed him all the words she'd never said, one by one, even if he never heard them. One day, she stumbled on an old post of his from 3 years ago. A photo of their balcony, a pothos plant, lush and sprawling, its vines dangling nearly 6 feet down. The caption, 2 years of growing, and it's almost touched the floor. She zoomed in on the photo and noticed a sticky note on the edge of the pot. She squinted, struggling to read the faded handwriting. She once said she loved pothos. If she ever comes home, I hope she sees it. Serena held the phone up close, staring for ages. The ink had blurred with time, but it was unmistakably his. She'd said she loved pothos. That was years ago. She'd forgotten she ever said it, but he remembered. He bought the plant and tended it for 2 years, just so she might see it when she came home. But she'd hardly ever come home, so rarely that the pothos had grown from a tiny sprout to a cascade of vines 6 feet long, and she'd barely glanced at it. She walked to the balcony. The plant was still there. The vines had now reached the floor, looped around twice, still reaching. The sticky note was long gone, fallen off maybe, or rotted away. Only a faint adhesive stain remained on the pot. Serena reached out and traced that faint mark. She knelt down and gently coiled the trailing vines back around the plant stand, loop after loop, like tying a knot around a long overdue answer. She crouched there, watching the pothos leaves tremble in the breeze, and suddenly she was crying. Not the quiet, stifled crying. This time she let it out, alone on the balcony, shoulders heaving, sobbing like a child who'd lost her favorite toy. A month later, Serena went back to Michael Joe. She brought a bottle of sake, the brand Ethan had loved in college. Michael glanced at the label, raised an eyebrow, and wordlessly pulled out 2 cups. It's not the 3rd time, Serena said first. I just wanted to have a drink with you. Michael didn't argue. He poured her half a cup, and himself half a cup. The restaurant's warm light glowed around them. Outside, autumn wind rattled the paper lantern by the door. Neither spoke for a while, finishing 2 rounds in companionable silence. Finally, Michael broke it. He's doing okay. Serena's fingers tightened around her cup. He's in Shenzhen, at Villaris's southern headquarters, rented a small place, lives alone, works, comes home, eats, sleeps, pretty regular. He glanced at her face. A little thinner, but his spirits are fine. Serena looked down at the last drops of sake in her cup. Did he mention me? Michael was quiet for a moment. Once, he said he knew you'd come looking for him. And he said he was afraid of that, because if you did, he might not be able to stay away. Serena looked up, her eyes startlingly bright. Mikhail Sahil, Serena, what he needs right now isn't for you to chase after him. If he really wanted to cut you off, he wouldn't have told his mum or me. He wouldn't have left you a trail to follow. He left you a door, but you have to push it open yourself. Serena drained the last of her sake. Clean and sharp on the way in, warm and lingering on the way down, like the man she knew, soft on the surface, stubborn as hell underneath. Where in Shenzhen? Michael gave her the district, then added, Villaris HQ is easy to spot. There's a giant logo on the roof. Serena nodded. She stood and pulled a wad of cash from her bag, laying it on the counter. For the drinks? Michael didn't argue. He pocketed it. At the door, he called after her. Serena. She turned. He changed his number. I'll send you the new one on WeChat. Serena's nose stung. She tipped her head back to keep the tears from spilling, then gave him a shaky smile. Thanks. That night, she received a message from Michael with a phone number. She stared at it for a long time. She didn't save it. She didn't call. She put the phone on her nightstand. Then she picked it up again, typed the digits into her contacts, and saved the name as Ethan Barn. Then she turned off the screen, pressed the phone to her chest, and closed her eyes. Her heart was racing, just like the night she'd received his first love letter. Serena booked a flight to Shenzhen 3 days later. In those 3 days, she did a lot. She handed off her current projects, arranged 2 weeks of remote meetings, and deep-cleaned the entire apartment. She finished the last box of Ethan's dumplings, eating the final one slowly, chewing each bite as if she could memorize the taste forever. She changed into comfortable clothes, not a suit, but a soft grey sweater, jeans, and sneakers. She let her hair down, free of its usual tight bun. She looked at herself in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. It had been so long since she'd seen herself like this, younger, like she'd just graduated. At the front door, she paused. The grey men's slippers were still on the shoe rack. She reached down and straightened them. On the drive to the airport, she took a deep breath, checked in, cleared security, boarded. As the plane lifted off and the clouds spread beneath her, she remembered the first time they'd flown together, right after graduation. He'd sat by the window, holding her hand the whole time, his palms sweaty. First time on a plane, he'd confessed. She'd teased him, and he'd scratched his head, embarrassed. That trip, they'd gone to Dali and rented bicycles by Erhay Lake. She'd ridden on the back, arms around his waist, as he pedaled slowly, claiming the road was too rough. But really, he didn't want her to fall. At night, they squeezed into a single bed in their hostel. She complained it was too cramped. He offered to sleep on the floor. She refused. They argued like children over who got the bed and who got the floor, until neither got either. They ended up tangled together all night, waking up sore and laughing. That was 10 years ago. She closed her eyes, and the scene, the warmth, the laughter, it all felt fuzzy, like looking through frosted glass. She tried to wipe it clean, but the more she rubbed, the blurrier it got. A sudden fear gripped her. What if, when she reached Shenzhen and saw him, he'd become a stranger? What if he looked at her with nothing but polite distance? What if he said, Let's just call it quits. What if she was too late? Shenzhen. Velaris HQ was unmistakable. 50-plus stories, glass gleaming in the afternoon sun, the red logo visible from 3 blocks away. Serena stood across the street, not crossing. Her phone was in her hand, the screen showing the number she'd saved 3 days ago and still hadn't dialed. She'd imagined a dozen scenarios before coming, charging into the lobby, calling him to come down, or simply waiting for him after work. Now that she was here, she didn't do any of them. She just stood there, watching the building, the endless stream of people going in and out, scanning every face for one she recognized. She waited a long time, from noon until the sun began to slant west. Just as her legs were about to give out, a man emerged from the revolving doors. Her heart stopped. It was him. Ethan wore a dark blue jacket and carried a black laptop bag, head down, walking at a steady, unhurried pace. He was thinner, yes. The angles of his face were sharper now, his jawline clean and defined. His hair was shorter than before, and among the dark strands, she caught a few threads of silver glinting in the light. He reached the curb and stopped, pulling out his phone, and then he froze. He looked up, his gaze crossing the street, landing on her. A stream of cars flowed between them. Neither moved. Serena saw his lips part slightly, then close. His brow furrowed, just a fraction, as if making sure his eyes weren't playing tricks. She stepped forward. The light was red. A car roared past, forcing her to stop. Through the moving traffic, Ethan watched her from the other side. His expression was complicated, too layered for her to read. She'd always thought she knew him inside out, that one furrow of his brow told her everything. But now she realized she knew nothing. Not what he'd been through these past months, not what he came home to every night, not whether seeing her now made him glad or uneasy. The light turned green. Serena crossed the street, step by step, closing the distance. Up close, she saw him more clearly. He was thinner, hollows beneath his eyes, a thin scar on his chin, a shaving nick probably. He seemed quieter than she remembered, more settled. They stood face to face, 2 steps apart. Serena opened her mouth. She'd rehearsed so many lines, apologies, explanations, confessions, pleas. Every one of them had played through her head 100 times. But standing here now, none of them fit. What came out was small, nearly lost in the traffic noise. The dumplings you made, I finished them. Ethan's eyes went red in an instant. He turned his head away, drew a breath, and when he faced her again, his expression was composed, but his voice was still rough. Do you want more? Serena nodded, nodding so hard it was almost comical, the nod of a child who'd been forgiven and didn't quite know how to handle it. Ethan looked at her, her red-rimmed eyes, the sheen of sweat on her nose, her wind-tangled hair. He smiled. It was a small, light smile, but Serena recognized it. It was the smile he wore only when he was completely at ease with her. I've got some in my fridge, he said. Ethan's apartment was small, 1 bedroom, spotless and uncluttered, like him. Quiet, undemanding, everything in its proper place. Serena followed him inside, kicked off her shoes, and took in the white sofa, the book on the coffee table, 100 Years of Solitude, Astatach, a bookmark halfway through, and the clean dishes drying on the kitchen rack. Her gaze landed on a pothos in the corner, same as the one at home, leaves lush and green, vines already beginning to trail down. She didn't say anything, but he followed her eyes. They grow here too, he said. 4 words. Serena almost lost it. Ethan walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and pulled out a container. Dumplings. Fresh ones, just like the batch at home, perfectly lined up. "Shrimp and chive," he said. "The shrimp's good here." She stood at the kitchen doorway, watching him boil water, drop in the dumplings, mix the dipping sauce, each motion practiced and fluid. Back home, she'd rarely watched him cook. She'd stick her head in and ask, "Almost ready?" And that was it. She'd never really tease him. He bent slightly over the stove, the flame lighting his profile, his long lashes trembling in the steam. He lifted a hand to his forehead. No sweat, just habit. The dumplings came to the table. They sat across from each other, one plate each, sharing the dipping sauce. Serena picked one up and bit into it. The shrimp's sweetness, the chive's fragrance, the toothsome wrapper, all exactly as she remembered. She chewed, and tears slipped into her sauce dish. Ethan handed her a napkin, saying nothing. She wiped her face, took a breath, and set down her chopsticks. "Ethan, I'm sorry." His hand paused. He set his chopsticks across his bowl and met her eyes. "All this time," she spoke slowly, each word drawn from somewhere deep. "I don't know how to apologize for it. What I owe you isn't 1 day or 1 year, it's at least 2, maybe more. I was so caught up in my own world that I treated you like something that didn't need my attention. You sent so many messages, so many calls, and I never really responded. When you said you wanted to switch jobs, I said don't bother. When you said you wanted to talk, I didn't even look up." Her voice cracked. "You felt like a tenant because I, the landlord, never even opened the door." Ethan's gaze fell to the dumplings left in his bowl. He listened in silence. At last, he spoke. "Serena, I don't blame you. I really don't. He paused. "I just didn't want our relationship to be like this. It's not your fault or mine. We lost each other along the way." Serena's tears spilled again. "Can we find our way back?" "Slowly," he said. Serena tightened her grip on her chopsticks. Tears splattered onto the table, onto her plate, but she was smiling. She laughed and cried at the same time, shoving another dumpling into her mouth, cheeks puffed like a squirrel hoarding nuts. Ethan watched her, the corner of his mouth twitching. He reached over and nudged her dipping sauce dish closer to her. They sat there, in a small Shenzhen apartment, and finished the plate of dumplings. That night, Serena didn't leave. She slept on his sofa, under a thin blanket he'd pulled out for her. The sofa was too short, her feet hung off the end, but she slept more deeply than she had in months. She dreamed of college, Ethan playing guitar outside her dorm, a crowd of girls gathered around. He finished a song, looked up, and across the crowd, he found her. "Serena, that one was for you." She laughed in her dream and woke up. Morning light slanted through the curtains, landing on the arm of the sofa. From the kitchen came small sounds. He was making breakfast. She sat up, hair a mess, a crease from the blanket across her cheek. She shuffled to the kitchen in her borrowed slippers. He had his back to her, frying eggs, the oil sizzling, the smell filling the little room. He glanced over his shoulder. "Brush your teeth. There's a new toothbrush in the bathroom." Serena stood there, watching the tiny cowlick at the back of his head, and felt that all the agonizing of the past 6 months, the past year, the past 2 years, it had all been worth it. After breakfast, it was time for her to fly back to Shanghai. Her flight was in the afternoon, and Ethan walked her to the subway. Shenzhen's morning air was damp and green. The streets were already bustling, breakfast stalls queued 3 deep. They walked side by side, not holding hands, but close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed. "I've arranged remote work with the company," Serena said first. I can come here once a month, or you can come back on weekends. Ethan nodded. I can do that too. Tickets aren't that expensive. So it's settled? Settled. They reached the station. Serena stood at the turnstile, looking at him. Her lips moved, but everything that needed saying had been said last night. Instead, she reached out and touched his sleeve. A brief, tentative gesture, as if checking he was real. I'll be back next weekend, she said. Good. I'll make the 3 delicacy kind. She smiled, swiped her card, passed through the gate. A few steps in, she turned to look back. He was standing outside, hands in his pockets, giving her a small nod. She turned and walked down into the subway. As the escalator carried her down, she thought they still had a long way to go. But the path had begun. And that was everything. 6 months later, Serena moved to Shenzhen. Not because of Ethan, not entirely. She'd negotiated a new role with her company, head of the southern region. Base, Shenzhen. They'd balked at first, but she'd presented 3 proposals, half a year's performance data, and a detailed transition plan. Her boss finally slapped the table and said, Fine, go, but if the numbers drop, I'm holding you responsible. She said, Okay. On moving day, Ethan helped her pack. They stood in the Shanghai apartment they'd lived in for 5 years, boxing things up one by one. The living room sofa went to the next tenant, the kitchenware got split, a third packed, the rest given to the neighbor. The potos Serena insisted on bringing. Ethan watched her carefully wrap the plant in newspaper. That potos is 4 years old, he said. Serena's hands stilled. 4 years? Yeah. I bought it a year after you said you liked them. She looked down at the plant's veined leaves, and she said nothing. That night, all the boxes were sealed. The apartment was empty except for 2 chairs. They sat in them, facing the Shanghai skyline, talking in fragments. Back when you left, Serena finally asked, what were you thinking? Ethan was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, I felt like I had no reason to exist in your world anymore. No. She turned to look at him. You existed. I was just blind. He turned to her and smiled. What about now? She asked. Now? He considered. Now, I don't feel like a tenant anymore. Serena scooted her chair closer and leaned against his shoulder. She'd put on a little weight since their wedding, nothing dramatic, just enough that her shoulder was softer when she rested against him. He didn't pull away. He shifted to let her lean more comfortably. Outside, Shanghai glowed like scattered gold. Next weekend, Serena murmured, eyes closed. Let's go back to Dali. Okay. Ride bicycles. Okay. You can't go that slow again. I'll try. Serena laughed. She reached for his hand and laced their fingers together, the way they'd held hands that first time, so many years ago. Palm to palm, warm, right. She thought of the divorce certificate, with their separate portraits on a white background, eyes never meeting. If they ever took another photo together, she thought, it should have 3 subjects, him, her, and that pothos. At the end of the story, Serena and Ethan didn't remarry. Not yet, anyway. They lived together, 2 people who'd just met each other again, learning how to be together. He got up early on weekends to make congee. She put his dinner in a thermos on nights he worked late. They still bickered over small things, his socks on the floor, her skincare crowding the bathroom counter, but after every spat, one of them would soften first, bringing a glass of water or a plate of cut fruit. They'd both learnt. to put down their phones when the other spoke, to say coming instead of in a minute, to volunteer, something happened today, I want to tell you about it, to glance back every time they walked away. The days were still the same days, groceries, commutes, errands, but they weren't strangers under the same roof anymore. Serena had framed Ethan's letter and hung it above her desk, not as a reminder of past mistakes, but as a reminder some things came this close to being lost. She was glad she'd found them again. Ethan still made dumplings now and then. Whenever he did, Serena would drag a stool to the kitchen doorway, sit and watch him roll, mix, pinch, occasionally reaching in to steal a bit of filling, getting her wrist caught with a "it's raw taskra." She'd laugh. The kitchen light was warm, the steam rose, the pot bubbled on the stove. Outside, Shenzhen's dusk stretched over the high-rises, the city no kinder just because they'd made up. But inside their little kitchen, it was gentle. The night Serena flew back to Shanghai, she landed late. She didn't rush home. In the back of the taxi, she watched the city lights slide past. Her phone lit up with a message from Ethan, sent 2 hours ago. "Text me when you land." Dodged. She typed, landed, paused, then added, "You still awake? Esther." A few seconds later, a one-word reply. "No, Eskak." Serena stared at that "no" for a long time. The driver up front asked, "Miss, which complex?" She gave the address, then looked back down at her phone and typed, "I have a meeting tomorrow. As soon as it's done, I'll come find you. Stars?" "Don't bother," Ethan replied. I'm coming back this weekend." "As is, station." "Yes, I took Friday afternoon off." "Asda?" Serena looked at the screen and felt that December wind didn't bite so much anymore. She held her phone in her palm like a warm stone. That night, for the first time in ages, she didn't open her laptop. She showered, changed into pajamas, and lay down on the king-size bed. The pillow on the left was empty. She patted it, thinking he'd be back there in a couple of days. She smiled as she drifted off. The smile stayed on her face even after she fell asleep. Friday, Serena left work early. She'd cancelled her last meeting, told Henry, "I'm heading out," and walked out under his bewildered stare. At the supermarket, she loaded up on groceries, spare ribs, shrimp, lotus root, yams, a bundle of baby greens. She remembered Ethan loved braised ribs and stir-fried greens, but she wasn't sure about the specifics. She pulled up recipes on her phone, bought all the seasonings, and headed home. Once inside, she washed her hands and got to work. 2 hours of clattering in the kitchen revealed her cooking instincts were rusty. She forgot to skim the scum off the ribs, burnt the sugar when caramelizing, and sent a yam rolling off the counter to split in two on the floor. She stood in the middle of the mess, half frustrated, half amused. In the end, she abandoned her grand ambitions and settled on a one-pot rib soup with yams, corn, and carrots. It didn't flop. The doorbell rang just as she was tasting the broth. She set down the ladle, wiped her hands, and opened the door. Ethan stood there with a black carry-on, wearing a grey windbreaker, his hair wind-tossed. She opened her mouth to say the things she'd rehearsed. "You look thinner. Long trip? Are you hungry?" But he beat her to it. "Why does it smell burnt in here?" Serena blinked, then she burst out laughing. "Come in. It's not burnt, just like you were cooking." "Trying." She rubbed her fingers together. "Probably not great." Ethan walked past her to the kitchen without a word. She followed, watched him lift the lid, peer at the soup, then at the clumsily chopped yam slices on the counter. He turned around, and the corner of his mouth was definitely twitching. You need to soak yams in water before cutting them. They oxidize. Oh. Let me. No, she started, but he was already shrugging off his jacket, draping it over a chair, rolling up his sleeves, and moving to the sink. He took the half-cut yam from her, peeled and sliced with practiced ease, dropping the pieces into a bowl of water. Serena stood beside him, watching. The kitchen light fell on the back of his neck, where a patch of skin had darkened from the Shenzhen sun. He focused on the cutting with his lashes lowered, shielding his eyes. She felt like she'd been waiting for this scene for years. "Ethan," she said. "Hmm?" He didn't turn. "When you weren't here," she said, "I thought about this kitchen having someone in it every day." He paused, knife mid-air. He turned his head and looked at her. His expression was mild, but something in his eyes caught light. He didn't answer with words, just turned back to the cutting board, his strokes a little slower than before. Serena didn't push. She dragged her stool over and sat in the doorway, watching him cook. The soup was re-seasoned, the ribs falling off the bone tender, the yams soft, the corn sweet. Serena spooned some up, and her eyes lit up. "Tastes way better than mine." Ethan plated the dishes, glancing at her. "You want to learn? I'll teach you." "Yes," she said, so fast it was almost comical. They sat down to dinner, a pot of rib soup and a plate of stir-fried greens. No candles, no wine, no grand declarations. Just the click of chopsticks, the murmur of small talk. But Serena thought it was the best meal she'd had in 6 months. After they ate, Serena insisted on doing the dishes. Ethan didn't fight her, just leaned against the doorframe and watched her scrub. She wasn't great at it, too much soap, too many rinses. He reached over and turned down the water pressure. "It won't splash as much." She glanced at him. He stood half in shadow, half in light, his profile sharp. She opened her mouth. "Ethan, I need to tell you something." "Yeah." "I want to move to Shenzhen." His posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. He was quiet for a moment. "What about your company?" "I've already talked to them," she said, turning to face him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Southern Region Head. Same title, same pay. My boss wasn't thrilled, but he didn't say no." Ethan met her gaze. He knew that look, the look she wore when she'd already thought through every contingency, every risk, every escape route. "You sure?" he asked. "Not sure," she admitted. "But I know I'll regret it if I don't try." He looked down at the slippers on his feet, grey-blue, fleece-lined, the same as the pair he'd left behind, except a size bigger. She must have bought them, not sure if his feet had grown, just in case. "Serena," he said slowly, "think it through. You're moving cities, changing everything. What if you get there and... "There's no what if," she cut him off. Her voice was steady, as if stating an immutable fact. "I've spent my whole life saying later. Losing you was the biggest one. I'm done waiting for later." He looked at her, at the gloss of tears in her eyes, at the straight line of her back, at her fingers still gripping the edge of her apron. He took a long breath and let it out, slow. "All right," he said. "Rent's cheaper here than Shanghai. Come on over. I'll save you a room." Serena froze. "Room?" He looked away, a faint flush creeping up his ears. "I mean, not a room. I mean, my couch is too short for you." "Oh," she bit down on a smile. "Then I'll need to buy my own bed." "Whatever you want." "You'll have to help me pick it out at the furniture store." "Fine." Serena turned back to the sink, the water running, hiding the grin she couldn't keep down. She didn't look back, but her voice came out sparkling. And you need another pothos. One for me, one for you. Why do we need so many pothos? Fill up the balcony. Okay. The kitchen lights stretched their shadows long, one bent over the sink, one leaning in the doorway. On the floor, their shadows overlapped, impossible to tell apart. 3 months later, Serena officially moved to Shenzhen. She rented a 2-bedroom, 15 minutes walk from Ethan's place. She didn't move into his apartment, neither mentioned the option. They both understood. 2 people who'd lost each other once needed to approach each other slowly, not crash back into the same front door. On weekends, Ethan came over, bringing vegetables and fish, cooking in her small kitchen. Serena helped, washing, peeling, passing plates, occasionally stealing a piece of braised rib and burning her tongue but refusing to spit it out. New habits formed. Friday evenings at the wet market together. Sunday morning walks in the park, 1 movie a month. Small routines, like tracing over a broken line with a new pen. One night, they were curled on her sofa watching an old film. Halfway through, her phone rang, a work call from her old Shanghai colleague. She glanced at the screen, hit silent, and nestled back against his shoulder. Ethan looked down at her. Not taking it? Tomorrow, she murmured, eyes closed. He didn't push, he just pulled the blanket from the armrest and draped it over her knees. On screen, the lovers ran along the beach. Waves and music swelled, warm and distant. Serena's breathing slowed. She might have been asleep. Ethan looked at her. In sleep, her brow was smooth, not the taut intensity of work, not the shattered look he'd seen outside the divorce office. She looked peaceful, like she'd finally landed somewhere safe. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, so gently she didn't stir. Outside, Shenzhen blazed with lights, not so different from Shanghai. But to Serena, the city was no longer just a dot on a map. It had coordinates. The fishmonger at the 3rd stall, who knew Ethan and always saved him the best catch. The convenience store clerk, who smiled when they came in together. The pothos that had overgrown half the balcony railing, every leaf watered by both of them. Life moved forward, steady and slow. Another year passed. Early summer, Serena and Ethan returned to Shanghai for a company gala, her company's 5-year anniversary. She was still the major shareholder, and they'd invited Ethan back as a guest speaker. He'd hesitated, then agreed. Serena went with him. The dinner was held in the company lobby, a dozen tables set up, chandeliers blazing. Serena took the stage as CEO, delivering her remarks to a few hundred people. Her eyes swept the room and landed on the back row. Ethan, sitting alone with a juice glass, watching her, a subtle smile tugging at his mouth. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then continued smoothly. Only she knew her heart had skipped 2 beats. After the dinner, they walked out into the Shanghai summer night, humid, muggy, a breeze stirring the heat. Serena's heels started to rub after a few steps. She didn't complain, but her pace slowed. Ethan dropped to a crouch in front of her. Hop on. I'm fine, Hop on. She hesitated, then climbed onto his back. He shifted her weight, his hands steady under her thighs, and started walking. The plane trees along the street were in full leaf, streetlight filtering through in patches of light and shadow. Ethan, she said, her chin on his shoulder. That cake place, do you still keep in touch with the owner? Which one? The one from my birthday, the rain, the squashed cake? He thought for a moment. I remember. What about it? Nothing. I just wanted to say, I should have eaten it. Even if it went bad, I should have eaten it. Ethan said nothing, but his grip on her tightened. After a few steps, he said, "For your next birthday, I'll order you a new one." "Don't order." "What then?" "You make it. Whatever it looks like, I'll finish it." He laughed softly, and she felt the vibration through his back. "Be warned, I'm a lot better at dumplings than cakes." "I don't care." "Okay." Serena pressed her face into his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of his laundry detergent. Across the street, a young couple on a shared bike pedaled past, the girl laughing with her arms around the boy's waist. Some roads, she thought, do take detours, but a road that winds is still a road. At least they were still walking it together.